There is a particular kind of silence that a phone makes when someone has blocked your number. It's not the silence of an unanswered call, which has rhythm, rings, then voicemail, then the mechanical invitation to leave a message. This silence is different. Immediate. A wall rather than a door. You call, and the line doesn't even try. It simply stops. I discovered that silence on a Tuesday morning in April, standing in my kitchen in yesterday's clothes, calling Declan for the 14th time. I'd been calling since Sunday evening. I'd driven past his flat on Monday after work and found it dark and the curtains drawn in the particular way of rooms that have been empty for longer than a day. Not the casual disorder of someone who'd stepped out, but the settled stillness of somewhere recently vacated. I told myself there was an explanation. There is always an explanation in the hours before you stop needing one. The 14th call hit the wall. I lowered the phone and stood in the kitchen for a while, looking at nothing specific, and then I did what I should have done on Sunday evening instead of spending 48 hours inventing explanations. I called Petra. She didn't answer either. My name is Emery. I'm 38 years old. I work in technical documentation for a mid-sized software company, the kind of work that is invisible when done well and catastrophic when done badly, which is a description that turned out to apply to more than my career. I live in a second-floor flat in the western part of the city, a place I'd chosen for its light and its proximity to the canal path where I run in the mornings, and which I share with 2 large bookshelves and a coffee machine I spent too much money on and a recently acquired absence that used to be a relationship. Petra and I had been together for 2 years and 3 months. She was 34, worked in pharmaceutical research, laughed at things that weren't obviously funny, and had a habit of reading 2 books simultaneously, one serious, one not, that I had always found specific and appealing. We had been, I thought, the kind of couple who had moved past the performance of early relationships into something more durable. The kind that books groceries together and argues mildly about whose turn it is to deal with the landlord and falls asleep on the sofa at 9:30 on a Friday with no sense of failure. Declan had been my best friend for 16 years. We'd met in the first week of university. I was studying technical writing. He was studying economics. Neither of us knew anyone, and we happened to sit next to each other at a welcome lecture and discovered, within 20 minutes, that we shared an almost identical set of references and an almost completely incompatible set of opinions, which is the exact combination required for a lasting friendship. He was quick, charming, constitutionally optimistic, and the kind of man who could convince you, against your better judgment, that the situation was fine, that the plan made sense, that the risk was worth it. He had convinced me of things before. That is relevant to what happened. He had also, 8 months before that Tuesday morning in April, borrowed £11,000. I want to say that number plainly, without the cushioning language people use when they're embarrassed about their own decisions, because the embarrassment is part of the story and pretending it isn't would be dishonest. £11,000. The precise sum I'd been saving toward a mortgage deposit, transferred in 2 installments to Declan's account over the course of a September weekend after he told me, in the specific, slightly desperate way that only old friends can communicate, when the performance has worn off and what's underneath is briefly visible, that he was in serious trouble. He was, he said, behind on rent by 4 months. His freelance consultancy work had dried up. A client had disputed a large invoice and was threatening legal action. He needed time to sort it out. He would pay me back within 6 months. He would pay interest. He could show me the invoice dispute, the correspondence, the figures. He had not asked anyone else because he could not bear for anyone else to see it. He was my best friend of 16 years. I transferred the money. And then, 7 months later, on a Sunday in April, both he and Petra stopped answering their phones on the same day. I stood in my kitchen on that Tuesday morning and looked at the silence where 2 people had been and understood, with the specific, cold clarity of something you've been assembling without knowing it, what the silence meant. To understand how this happened, I have to go back further than September. Back to before the money, before the obvious signs I reread obsessively in the months after. Back to the ordinary life that was the container for all of it. Petra and Declan had known each other for 18 months before the end. They'd met at my birthday dinner in the autumn of the year before last. One of those easy, crowded evenings where everyone is at their most charming and you don't think to watch for anything because there's nothing to watch for. Declan had been between relationships then, which was a recurring state for him. Not because he was unlovable, but because he was the kind of person who made an exceptional first impression and a more complicated longer one. He was funny at dinner, attentive to everyone, told a story about a disastrous camping trip that made Petra laugh until she had to set down her glass. I remember watching the table that evening and feeling the particular contentment of having the people you care about most in the same room. That was 18 months before the end. I want to be honest about how ordinary it seemed, how completely I failed to see anything that needed seeing. The friendship between Petra and Declan had developed naturally after that, through the social gravity of shared circles, group events, occasions where my two worlds overlapped. She liked him. She told me this plainly, early on. Declan is genuinely funny, not just performs funny. I agreed. I was glad they got on. It made things easier. What I understand now, tracing it backward with the advantage of complete information, is that the friendship between them deepened most significantly in the 6 months before the money. The 6 months when Declan's finances were deteriorating and he hadn't yet told me. The 6 months when, I now believe, something between them was beginning, or at least becoming something that had weight to it. The early signs were things I cataloged and dismissed, in the way you dismiss things when the catalog is being assembled by someone who doesn't yet know what he's collecting. The first was a joke that died. We were the three of us at a pub in late July. A warm evening, the kind the city produces occasionally in summer that feels like borrowed weather. I'd gone to the bar, and when I came back with the drinks, there was a half-second in which Petra and Declan were mid-something. A sentence, an exchange, that ended the moment I appeared. Not dramatically, just the ordinary editing of a private conversation when a third person returns. Except when I sat down, the conversation resumed in a slightly different register, a degree or two more general. Less intimate. I set down the drinks. I said something. They both laughed. The evening continued. I filed that half-second under nothing and left it there for months. The second sign was in August. Petra had started running, which she'd mentioned once and which I'd half-registered and then moved on from. The way couples move past pieces of information that don't require immediate engagement. But one morning she came home from a run at a time that didn't correspond to the route she'd mentioned. And when I noted this, casually, not accusingly, just the arithmetic of time and distance, she said she'd taken a different loop, gone further than planned, lost track. She smiled when she said it. It was a true-sounding explanation. I accepted it. Declan ran. He'd been running for years, along the canal path near his flat, which was 3 streets from the path I used myself. I hadn't thought about this in relation to Petra's new habit. I think about it constantly now. The third sign, and the one I return to most often, was something Petra said in September, the same month I transferred the money. We were in bed, a Sunday morning, the particular ease of the kind of morning that belongs entirely to itself. She was reading. I was half awake, and she said, without looking up from her book, "Do you think people can be fundamentally different at 30 from who they were at 25? I said something vague and affirmative. She turned a page. I should have asked what she meant. I should have asked who she was thinking about. I was 38 and she was 34 and neither of us was 25, and the question had a specificity to it that, if I had been paying a different kind of attention, I would have heard. I was not paying that kind of attention. 2 weeks later, Declan asked me for £11,000. The money changed something in me that I didn't immediately identify as suspicion. I called it generosity fatigue, the mild internal awkwardness that follows a large financial decision, the phantom awareness of an amount that should be there and isn't. I told myself this was normal, that helping a friend should cost something, and the discomfort was the cost. But the discomfort had a texture I couldn't quite account for. Declan's behavior after the transfer was almost exactly right. He was grateful without being excessive about it. He sent a formal note of the terms we'd agreed, not an IOU, a proper document he'd had drafted, with repayment schedule and a nominal interest rate. He gave me updates. The invoice dispute was moving toward resolution. He'd picked up 2 new consultancy clients. The rent arrears were being addressed. The updates were regular enough to be reassuring and detailed enough to be convincing. Almost exactly right. Not quite. The thing that nagged at me, and I am reconstructing this with more clarity than I had at the time, because hindsight assembles narrative from what was, in the moment, mere atmospheric unease, was a shift in how he was with me. A slight increase in warmth. Declan was always warm. But this was the particular warmth of someone managing a relationship rather than simply being in one. Slightly more attentive, slightly more prompt with messages. The warmth of a man maintaining something. I noticed this and translated it as guilt. He felt bad about the money and was compensating with extra effort. This was plausible. This was, in some sense, probably true. But it wasn't the whole truth, and the gap between the plausible explanation and the complete one is where most of the damage lived. Petra in October and November was also almost exactly right. Still herself, still warm, still the person who read 2 books at once and laughed at things that weren't obviously funny. But she had started spending more time with her colleague Miriam, who I'd met once and liked in the abstract way you like people you don't know well. Late evenings described as work drinks, or Miriam's birthday, or just the two of them catching up. I didn't question it because I had no reason to, and because I trusted Petra in the settled, unexamined way of someone 2 years into a relationship who has stopped testing the foundation because it's felt solid for so long. One evening in November, I called her while she was apparently with Miriam, and the background sound was wrong. Not dramatically, just wrong in the small specific way of a background that doesn't match its described location. She rang back 20 minutes later with a slight breathlessness that she explained as having walked outside to get better signal, and the explanation was the right shape, and I accepted it. I looked up Miriam on Petra's social media that evening. Not with suspicion, exactly. More with the slightly guilty curiosity of someone checking something they don't quite want to have a reason to check. Miriam existed, was real, had the digital presence of a genuine person. I felt mildly ashamed of myself for looking and closed the browser. The red herring arrived in December, and it was nearly catastrophic in how thoroughly it redirected me. I found, on our shared streaming account, that a film had been watched at a time when Petra said she'd been at work. A film on a Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. She was a researcher. Her hours were flexible, but broadly conventional. 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday was unusual. I mentioned it, casually, as a passing observation, not as an accusation. She looked at me with genuine puzzlement. I watched 20 minutes of it on my lunch break, she said. The office was quiet. What? I just noticed, I said. Curious. She went back to what she was doing. And the thing was, the explanation was entirely consistent. She had watched 20 minutes. The watch history showed exactly that. I had been, briefly, suspicious of something completely innocent. That near miss convinced me, in the way near misses sometimes do, that my instincts were unreliable, that I was looking for patterns that didn't exist because the money situation had made me anxious and the anxiety was manifesting as groundless suspicion. I deliberately stood down. I told myself to stop cataloging. So I stopped, and the thing I'd been slowly assembling, piece by careful piece, was left unfinished for another 4 months. Until April. Until the Sunday both phones went silent on the same day. The first person I called, after 14 attempts to reach Declan and the same number to Petra, was my friend Joel. Joel had known Declan almost as long as I had. Not quite 16 years, but 12, which is enough to have the same full resolution picture. He was a secondary school teacher, patient and forensically observant in the way of someone who has spent years learning to read a room full of teenagers. When I called him on Tuesday morning and told him what I knew, which was, still, only that both phones were unreachable and both people were absent, he listened without interrupting. Then he said, "How long has it been?" "Since Sunday evening," I said. "Both of them." "Both of them." A pause. "Emery," he said carefully, "have you thought about the possibility that this is connected?" I had. I had been not thinking it as loudly as I could manage since Sunday. Hearing it said plainly by someone else was the moment it became undeniable rather than merely possible. "Yes," I said. "Okay," he said. "Don't do anything until we've talked properly. Come over tonight." I went to Joel's that evening. His wife Sandra made dinner that no one ate much of, and we sat in their kitchen and I laid out what I had. The timeline, the phone silence, the money, the things I'd noticed and dismissed over the previous months. The July pub evening with the edited conversation. The running. The October background noise. The question Petra had asked in September about whether people could be fundamentally different at 30 than at 25. Joel listened to all of it. Then he said, the question in September. She wasn't asking about herself. I looked at him. She was asking about him, he said. About Declan. She'd been spending time with him by then, I'd guess. She was trying to work out whether the man she was seeing was different from the man she thought she knew. I sat with that. The question reformatted itself in my mind. Can people be fundamentally different at 30 from who they were at 25? And this time I heard it from a different angle, and it landed somewhere that hurt. She already knew him, I said. Before September. She'd been meeting him since June, Sandra said quietly. I looked at her. I'm sorry, she said. I saw them. In June, at the farmer's market near her office. They were together in the way you're together. I didn't know how to tell you. I told myself maybe I'd misread it. She looked at her hands. I should have told you. June. For months before the money. 10 months before the phones went silent. She wasn't a cause of the loan request, Joel said slowly. She may have been a reason for it. I worked through what that meant in the drive home. Declan had needed money. Genuinely, I still believed that part. The desperate quality of that conversation was not performable by someone who wasn't desperate. But the desperation may have been partly fueled by something I hadn't known was happening. An emerging relationship that perhaps he'd wanted the financial space to pursue without the constraint of debt and failing work pulling him backward. He hadn't borrowed money to run from me. He'd borrowed it to build something I wasn't supposed to know about. The week after the phones went silent, I found what I needed. Not through investigation exactly, but through the ordinary digital residue of modern life. Petra's lease, which we had discussed jointly when she renewed it in January, had a guarantor form she'd sent me to countersign. I still had the PDF. The address on it was her flat. But when I drove past on Wednesday, the windows were empty in the way I'd seen at Declan's. The curtains, which she'd always kept open, were drawn. She had not renewed the lease. She had let it lapse and moved out and had not mentioned this. To me, to our shared social circle, to anyone I could find who would admit to knowing. I called her sister B on Thursday. B was 2 years older than Petra, warmer and more direct, and when she answered, her voice had the particular careful quality of someone who is deciding in real time how much to say. She's all right, B said. Where is she? I said. A pause. I can't tell you that, Emery. I'm sorry. She's all right, and she'll contact you when she's ready. B, I said. She's gone. Her flat is empty. My best friend has disappeared with 11,000 pounds of my money. I'm not asking for drama. I need to know she's safe. Another pause. Longer. She's safe, she said. She's with someone. With Declan, I said. Silence. Yes, she said. Finally. Yes. They had gone to Edinburgh. I found this not through B, who had said as much as she was going to say, but through a source I hadn't anticipated. Declan's younger brother Finn, who was 26 and worked in a bar and had neither the loyalty nor the strategic thinking to maintain the story he'd apparently been asked to maintain. I called Finn on the Friday, not because I expected him to know, but because I was working outward through every available contact, and he was on the list. He answered on the second ring, and when I told him I was trying to find Declan, there was a half-second pause of exactly the wrong kind. He mentioned you might call, Finn said, which was confirmation, though not the kind Finn had intended to provide. Where is he, Finn? I said. A longer pause. Then, with the exhausted reluctance of someone who has been asked to carry something too heavy, Edinburgh. They both are. He's got a sublet sorted. He said he was going to contact you once they were settled. Once they were settled, I repeated. I know, Finn said. I know. I told him he should call you before he left. How long have you known? Since February. February. 2 months before the phones went silent. Which meant Finn had known, and B had known, and Sandra had known since June, and the only person who had not known was me, standing in my kitchen in yesterday's clothes calling a phone that had become a wall. I am not a confrontational person by nature. I am the kind of man who processes things slowly and thoroughly, who prefers to understand a situation completely before responding to it, who has on multiple occasions been told by people who care about me that I give too much benefit of the doubt for too long. I know this about myself. In this instance, I decided to set it aside. I called Declan from my own phone, which went immediately to the wall. Then I borrowed Joel's phone, which Declan would not recognize. He answered on the third ring. Declan, I said. A silence of a very particular quality. The silence of someone who has been waiting for a call they hoped wouldn't come and have now received it. Emery, he said. Are you going to hang up? No, he said. A pause. No. I owe you more than that. You owe me several things, I said. But I'll take the conversation first. We talked for 42 minutes. I know this because I was watching the call timer on Joel's phone with the fixed attention of someone who needs to hold on to something concrete, while everything else is unmoored. He told me, not fluently, not without long pauses, not without the particular quality of a person who has rehearsed this in their head and finds that the rehearsal doesn't survive contact with the actual moment, what had happened. He and Petra had met for coffee in May, alone, at her suggestion. She had wanted to know how he was, genuinely, as Declan's friend, as someone who had noticed, through me, that he was struggling. The meeting had become another. The other meetings had become something with weight. By June, by the farmer's market that Sandra had seen and not known how to tell me about, it had become what it was. Why the money? I said. The money was real, he said. The invoice dispute was real. I was genuinely behind on rent. But, a pause. I also needed to be able to think about leaving without being in a position where I couldn't. I needed some kind of foundation, I said. He was quiet. Yes. Built on mine. He didn't answer that. Were you together when you asked me? I said. Yes. Did Petra know you were asking me? The pause that followed was the longest of the conversation. Yes, he said. I sat with that for a moment. The particular quality of what it meant, that she had known, that the conversation about the money had happened while she already knew what was between them, that she had perhaps even been somewhere proximate to it. I'm going to need the money back, I said. Not as a threat, as a fact. I'll give you time to arrange it, and I'll put it through a solicitor so we both have clarity, but I need it back. I know, he said. I know that. I'll pay it back. All of it. All of it. I believed him. I'm not sure why, given the full context. Perhaps because the money had always felt separate from the betrayal. The betrayal was personal, the money was structural, and structural problems have structural solutions. I need to talk to Petra, I said. She knows, he said. She'll call you. Tell her I need her to call me today, I said. Not when she's ready. Today. She called that evening. It was the harder conversation of the two, not because she was less honest, but because honesty from someone who loves you differently than you thought is its own specific category of pain. She told me she had not planned it. She told me she had tried to stop it. She told me she was sorry for how it had been done, the disappearance, the silence, the simultaneous absence, and that the how was not what she'd wanted, but that Declan had been afraid of my response, and she had been afraid of Declan's fear, and they had handled it in exactly the wrong way. You knew about the money, I said. Yes, she said. You didn't tell me. No. You let me hand my savings to someone who was already. Yes, she said, quietly, without defense. I know what that was. I know what I did. I'm sorry. I closed my eyes. Opened them. The kitchen was very still. Goodbye, Petra, I said. Goodbye, Emery, she said. I put the phone down and sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets for a while. The coffee machine made its small maintenance sound. Outside, someone was walking along the canal path in the early dark, their footsteps faint and receding. The money came back in 3 installments over 7 months. Declan made the first payment 2 weeks after the phone call, a gesture of seriousness, I think, rather than capacity. The second came 4 months later. The third and final payment arrived in November with a short message attached. This is the last of it. I'm sorry, Emery, for everything. I know that doesn't cover it. I read the message twice. I didn't reply. I'm not sure what reply would have been honest. Joel and Sandra had us both to dinner separately, in the months after. Me first, then Declan, at careful intervals, navigating the particular diplomacy of mutual friendship during the aftermath of a rupture. I appreciated this. I told Joel he didn't have to manage it so carefully, that I wasn't going to make him choose. He told me that Sandra still felt guilty about the farmer's market and that she wanted me to know that. I told him to tell her it wasn't hers to carry. What I spent most of the subsequent year doing was not, as people sometimes assume, working through anger. The anger was present and real, but it had a specific duration, and then it subsided into something more useful. What I spent most of the year doing was trying to understand my own part in it. Not in the self-punishing way, not in the direction of taking responsibility for other people's choices, but in the honest way that requires you to look at yourself with the same clarity you'd apply to anyone else. And what I found, when I looked, was this. I had been very good at giving people the benefit of the doubt and very poor at sitting with doubt itself. Every sign I'd noticed, the half second in the pub, the running, the background noise, The September question I had processed as incoming data and immediately resolved it in the most generous available direction. Not because I was naive, because doubt is uncomfortable and resolution is not, and I had, over years, developed a strong preference for the less uncomfortable option. This is not a character flaw in the way that makes a person culpable, but it is a pattern that carries a cost. And the cost, in this case, was months of ordinary life spent on foundations that had already begun to shift. Foundations I could have tested earlier if I'd been more willing to sit with what I wasn't sure about. The money I've rebuilt. Slower this time, more deliberately, with the particular care of someone who has understood what it represents in a way I hadn't the first time. It isn't just a deposit anymore. It's a record of judgment recovered. Declan and Petra are still in Edinburgh, as far as I know. I have mutual friends who know things I don't ask about. This is a choice I've made deliberately, not out of bitterness, but out of the recognition that some information doesn't serve the person receiving it, and I no longer have the appetite for knowing the details of a life that isn't mine. There is a friendship-shaped absence in my life that I am not sure will ever be fully filled. 16 years is a long time. Declan knew me in the full-length way that only very old friends do, with the accumulated context, the shared references, the shorthand that takes years to build. That is genuinely gone. I can be honest about grieving it without excusing what happened. Both things are true simultaneously. What I've learned, and I want to be precise about this, because the lesson is more specific than the general warnings about trust and friendship that these situations tend to produce, is the difference between loyalty and willful blindness. I was loyal to Declan in the way I understood loyalty, generously, without conditions, without interrogation. What I understand now is that real loyalty includes honesty. It includes the willingness to say something feels wrong out loud to the person, rather than filing it away in the direction of the most charitable explanation. If I had been more honestly engaged with Declan in the months before September, if I had said you seem different, what's actually happening rather than accepting the version he offered, I might not have changed the outcome. But I would have been a truer friend, and I might have been 11,000 pounds better informed. That is not a comfortable conclusion. It's an honest one. Joel and I still meet most weeks. We've taken up a habit of walking along the canal on Sunday mornings, which started in the winter and has simply continued. We don't always talk much. The canal path is 2 miles each way, and some of the walk is just walking, just the cold and the water and the ordinary passage of time. I've found this sufficient. More than sufficient, on the good days. I am 38 years old. I know what I'm building now, and what I'm building it on, and who I'm building it with. That, in the end, is enough to start from. This story is, at its deepest structural level, about the cost of comfort, specifically, the comfort of resolved doubt. Emery is not a passive or inattentive person. He is, in fact, acutely observant. He notices the half-second in the pub, the running route that doesn't add up, the background noise that belongs to a different room, the September question with its unexamined specificity. The problem is not that he fails to collect the signals. The problem is what he does with them once collected. He resolves them, quickly, generously, in the direction of the least threatening interpretation and moves on. This pattern is so consistent that it becomes, in effect, a system. A way of managing discomfort by eliminating it before it has time to become knowledge. This is worth examining carefully, because it's one of the most human and most costly cognitive habits there is. At what point do you think you would have stopped resolving the signals and started sitting with them? The July evening in the pub? The running? The phone call with the wrong background? Most people, faced with the same evidence in the same emotional context, a trusted relationship, a 16-year friendship, would make similar choices. The comfort of a generous interpretation is not weakness, but it has a price, and in Emery's case that price accumulated across 10 months of unasked questions. The money is the story's most psychologically complex element, and the complexity doesn't lie where it first appears. The loan itself was genuine, the desperation was real, the invoice dispute existed. But the timing was not coincidental. Declan was in a relationship with Petra by May. By September, when he asked for the money, he had been maintaining a parallel life for 4 months. The loan provided not just financial relief, but strategic freedom, the ability to build an exit from his existing circumstances without being anchored by debt and instability. He borrowed money from the person he was betraying in order to fund the life he was building without him. This is a layering of betrayal that goes beyond the affair and into something more coldly architectural. Petra's awareness of the loan request is the story's hardest moment, harder, in some ways, than the disappearance itself. That she knew, that she allowed it to proceed, that she sat with the knowledge of what was being borrowed, and from whom, while maintaining the ordinary texture of her relationship with Emery. This represents a moral failure distinct from the affair. The affair can be understood through the complicated human grammar of unexpected feeling. The loan is harder to explain in those terms. It was a choice, made with full information. And yet, what Petra said in Edinburgh, that the how was not what she'd wanted, that Declan's fear had shaped the outcome in ways she hadn't controlled, is probably true. People in the grip of a significant emotional attachment frequently defer to the fear of the person they've chosen, even when that deferral produces harm to others. This doesn't excuse it, but it makes it comprehensible. The confrontation calls are worth examining for what Emery chose not to do. He did not perform anger. He asked questions. He established facts. He separated the financial issue from the personal one and addressed each with the same quiet precision he brings to everything. This was not performance of composure. It was the actual composure of someone who has processed enough of the shock to understand what he needs from the conversation. That clarity, achieved under pressure, is one of the story's most quietly powerful moments. Taken from a wider perspective, this story describes something universal and underexamined. The way trust, in long relationships, can become a form of blindness, not because trust is wrong, but because it is comfortable, and comfort reduces vigilance, and reduced vigilance creates the conditions in which ordinary warning signs go unread for months. The accumulation effect here is unusually precise. Each signal Emery received and resolved, the pub edit, the running route, the background noise, was individually deniable and collectively damning. The pattern only becomes visible in retrospect, assembled after the event. This is the particular cruelty of this kind of betrayal. It is designed, consciously or not, to remain within the margins of the explainable right up until the moment it isn't. By the time the evidence became undeniable, two phones simultaneously silent, two people simultaneously absent, the architecture of the deception was already complete. The point of no return in this story is not April, when the phones went silent. It is September, when Declan asked for the money and Petra said nothing. That was the moment at which the deception crossed from emotional into material, when it acquired a financial dimension that involved deliberate use of Emery's trust and resources to fund its own concealment. Before September, the affair was a private wrong. After September, it became a structural one. And it is the structural betrayal, the loan, that produces the story's deepest wound, because it converted the friendship itself into a vehicle. What the story ultimately asks, in its quietest register, is a question about the nature of loyalty, what it actually requires of us, beyond feeling. Emery was loyal in the emotional sense, present, generous, unquestioning. But genuine loyalty, the story suggests, requires honesty as much as warmth. It requires the willingness to say something is wrong before the evidence is undeniable. It requires the courage to sit with unresolved doubt rather than immediately eliminate it in the direction of comfort. That capacity to remain with uncertainty rather than resolve it prematurely is not instinctive. It has to be learned. And some lessons, as Emery discovered, cost more than they should have to. What he carries forward is not bitterness, which would be the simpler outcome, but something more useful, a clearer understanding of what his own patterns cost him and the quiet determination to build his savings, his friendships, his life on foundations he has actually tested. That is the most honest kind of starting over. Not the dramatic kind, the durable kind,